My name is Ethan, and I'm about to share with you the most difficult and transformative journey of my life. What I'm going to tell you might shock you. It might make you uncomfortable, but it's my truth. And if you're someone who's ever questioned everything you've been taught, if you've ever felt trapped by the very beliefs that were supposed to set you free, then maybe my story will resonate with you in ways you never expected. I'm sitting here in my apartment, looking back at a life that feels like it belonged to someone else entirely. 3 years ago, I was a devoted Jehovah's Witness. I spent my entire existence following rules I never questioned, believing in prophecies I never doubted, and living for a future I was promised would come. But something happened that changed everything. And what I discovered about the organization I had dedicated my life to shook me to my very core. You see, I wasn't just any member of the congregation. I was what they called an exemplary young man. I pioneered in field service, gave talks at assemblies, and was being groomed for greater responsibilities within the organization. My family was proud. My friends looked up to me, and I thought I had found my purpose in life. But beneath that perfect facade, something was stirring inside me that I couldn't ignore. No matter how hard I tried, it started with a simple question that I couldn't get out of my head. One evening, after a particularly intense Bible study where we discussed the end times and how only Jehovah's Witnesses would survive Armageddon, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The question that haunted me was this: what if we're wrong? What if the 8 million people in our organization aren't the only ones who deserve salvation? What if the billions of other human beings on this planet, people I had been taught to view as part of Satan's world, were actually good people living meaningful lives? For weeks, I tried to push these thoughts away. I prayed more, studied more, threw myself deeper into theocratic activities, hoping that increased devotion would silence the doubts. But instead of finding peace, I found more questions. Our teachings keep changing. Why were former members, including those who had served faithfully for decades, treated as if they were dead? Why was I discouraged from pursuing higher education, from forming close friendships with non-witnesses, from questioning anything the governing body taught? The breaking point came during a family dinner on a Sunday afternoon. My younger sister, who was 16 at the time, mentioned that one of her classmates had invited her to a birthday party. The reaction from my parents was immediate and severe. They launched into a lengthy explanation about how celebrating birthdays was pagan, how it would displease Jehovah, and how associating with worldly people would corrupt her spirituality. As I watched my sister's face fall, as I saw the light dim in her eyes, something inside me broke. That night, I did something I had never done before. I went online and started researching our beliefs from sources outside the Watchtower publications. What I found changed everything. I discovered that many of our unique doctrines, things I had been taught were biblical truths, were actually interpretations that had changed multiple times throughout the organization's history. I learned about failed prophecies about 1975, when thousands of witnesses sold their homes and quit their jobs because they were told Armageddon would come that year. I read testimonies from former witnesses, including former governing body members, who shared experiences that mirrored my own growing doubts. But the most devastating discovery was learning about the organization's handling of certain sensitive commands. Issues, particularly how they dealt with cases of abuse within congregations. The policy of requiring 2 witnesses to prove wrongdoing. The discouragement of reportees to authorities. The protection of the organization's reputation over the protection of victims. It all painted a picture of an institution that was far from the loving, protective, spiritual paradise I had been taught it was for months. I lived in a state of cognitive dissonance. During the day, I continued my routine of meetings, field service, and family worship. But at night, I researched more, I questioned more, and I felt the foundation of my entire worldview crumbling beneath me. The hardest part wasn't just learning that the organization had flaws. It was realizing that I had been living my life according to rules and beliefs that I had never truly examined for myself. The decision to leave didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of awakening that felt both terrifying and liberating. I started small, missing a meeting here and there, declining invitations to go out in field service, spending more time alone to think and process what I was learning. My family noticed the changes immediately. They became concerned, then worried, then suspicious. Elder visits became frequent. I was counseled about the dangers of independent thinking, reminded of my responsibilities, and warned about the consequences of straying from the organization. But I had already crossed a line from which there was no return. I had tasted intellectual freedom, and I couldn't go back to the mental imprisonment I had lived in for 22 years. The fear of losing my family, my friends, my entire support system was overwhelming. But the fear of living a lie for the rest of my life was even greater. The night I made my final decision to leave, I was sitting in my childhood bedroom, looking at photographs of Kingdom Hall gatherings, assembly memories, and field service groups. These pictures represented every significant moment of my life up to that point. But as I studied the faces in those photographs, including my own, I realized something profound. Despite being surrounded by people who claimed to love me unconditionally, I had never felt more alone or more disconnected from my authentic self. I wrote a letter to my parents that night. In it, I tried to explain my decision to help them understand that leaving the organization wasn't about rebellion or succumbing to worldly desires. It was about intellectual honesty, about living according to my conscience, about refusing to continue participating in something I could no longer believe in with complete conviction. I knew that writing that letter would likely mean losing the most important relationships in my life. But I also knew that staying would mean losing myself completely. The response was exactly what I had feared and expected. My parents were devastated, angry, and confused. They couldn't understand how their exemplary son, someone who had been so dedicated to the truth, could suddenly turn his back on everything they held sacred. The elders were called in, and I was subjected to hours of counseling sessions where I was encouraged to reconsider my decision, to think about the spiritual consequences of leaving Jehovah's organization. But for the first time in my life, I stood firm in my convictions. I explained that I couldn't live a double life, pretending to believe things I no longer accepted as true. I told them that my love for my family and my respect for their beliefs hadn't changed, but that I needed the freedom to live according to my own conscience. The meetings were emotional, sometimes heated, but ultimately futile. I had made my choice, and no amount of pressure or emotional manipulation could change my mind. The day I was officially disfellowshipped was one of the most painful experiences of my life. Sitting in that Kingdom Hall, surrounded by people who had been my spiritual family for over 2 decades, listening to the announcement that I was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses felt like a death. In their eyes, I had become someone to be avoided, someone whose very presence was spiritually dangerous. People who had claimed to love me like family suddenly couldn't acknowledge my existence. Walking out of that Kingdom Hall for the last time, I felt a mixture of grief and relief that I struggle to describe even now. I grieved for the relationships I was losing, for the security of having all my life's major decisions made for me, for the comfort of believing I was part of God's chosen people. But I also felt an incredible sense of relief, like I had been holding my breath for 22 years and could finally exhale. The first few months after leaving were the most difficult period of my life. I had to learn how to make decisions based on my own judgment rather than organizational guidelines. I had to figure out how to celebrate holidays, how to form friendships with people who had different beliefs, how to navigate a world I had been taught to fear and avoid. Some days, the loneliness was so intense that I questioned whether I had made the right choice, but slowly, gradually, I began to discover things about myself and about life that I never could have experienced within the restrictive environment I had left behind. I enrolled in college, something I had been discouraged from doing as a witness. I studied philosophy, history, and literature, subjects that opened my mind to new ways of thinking about existence, morality, and human purpose. For the first time, I was encouraged to think critically, to question assumptions, to form my own conclusions based on evidence and reason, rather than authority and tradition. I also began to form genuine friendships with people from diverse backgrounds and belief systems. What struck me most was how kind, moral, and spiritually minded many of these so-called worldly people were. They showed me love and acceptance without requiring me to conform to their beliefs or join their organizations. They respected my journey, supported my growth, and helped me heal from the trauma of losing everything I had once held dear. One of the most profound discoveries I made was that spirituality doesn't require organization or doctrine. I found that I could maintain a relationship with God, or whatever divine force governs the universe, without the mediation of human religious authorities. I learned to pray from my heart rather than from prescribed formulas, to find sacred meaning in everyday experiences, and to live according to principles of love and compassion rather than rules and regulations. As I began to heal and grow, I also started reaching out to others who had left high-control religious groups. I discovered an entire community of former witnesses who had walked similar paths, who understood the unique challenges of leaving everything you've ever known in pursuit of truth and authenticity. These connections were incredibly healing, helping me realize that I wasn't alone in my experience, and that my decision to leave wasn't a sign of weakness or spiritual failure, but of courage and integrity. About a year and a half after leaving, something unexpected happened. My younger sister, the same one whose disappointed face had been part of my awakening, reached out to me secretly. She had been struggling with many of the same doubts and questions that had led to my departure. Through carefully coded messages and secret meetings, I was able to share my story with her and provide her with resources to help her on her own journey of questioning and discovery. Watching my sister go through her own awakening was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She was younger than I had been when I left, but she was also braver in many ways. She saw through the organization's claims more quickly than I had, and she was more willing to prioritize her authentic self over the approval of family and congregation. When she finally made the decision to leave, I was there to support her through the process, something I hadn't had when I made my own exit. Our parents' reaction to losing a second child to what they viewed as apostasy was even more devastating than their response to my departure. The family dynamics became increasingly strained, with my parents oscillating between attempts to win us back through emotional manipulation and periods of complete shunning. It was during this time that I truly understood the depth of the psychological control the organization exercised over its members, including my own parents. But something beautiful emerged from this painful situation. My sister and I developed a bond that was deeper and more authentic than any relationship either of us had experienced within the organization. We were able to be completely honest with each other, to support each other through doubts and discoveries, and to celebrate each other's growth without judgment or condition. This relationship became the foundation for building a new kind of family, one based on love and acceptance rather than shared religious beliefs. As I rebuilt my life over the following months, I began to understand that leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses hadn't just been about rejecting false teachings or escaping organizational control. It had been about reclaiming my right to think, to choose, to fail, and to grow as an individual human being. I learned to make mistakes and learn from them, rather than living in constant fear of divine punishment. I discovered the joy of intellectual curiosity, the satisfaction of personal achievement, and the beauty of unconditional relationships. I also began to see my former faith from a more compassionate perspective. I realized that most witnesses, including my parents, were sincere people trying to live according to what they believed was God's will. They weren't evil or deliberately deceptive. They were caught in a system that discouraged critical thinking and punished dissent. Understanding this helped me let go of some of the anger I had carried toward the organization and toward family members who continued to shun me. 2 years after leaving, I decided to pursue a degree in counseling, specializing in helping people who had left high-control groups. My own experience had shown me how difficult the transition could be, how much support was needed, and how healing was possible with the right resources and community. I wanted to use my pain and my growth to help others navigate similar journeys. During my studies, I learned about the psychological mechanisms that make high-control groups so effective at maintaining member loyalty. I studied concepts like cognitive dissonance, thought-stopping techniques, and trauma bonding. Understanding these dynamics helped me make sense of my own experience and provided me with tools to help others recognize and break free from similar patterns of control. One of the most challenging aspects of my recovery was learning to trust my own judgment again. After spending my entire life being told what to think, what to feel, and what to do, making independent decisions felt overwhelming and sometimes terrifying. I had to learn that it was okay to be uncertain, that changing my mind based on new information was a sign of intellectual growth rather than spiritual weakness, and that I could make mistakes without facing divine retribution. I also had to work through feelings of guilt and shame about leaving my family's faith, even though I intellectually understood that I had made the right choice. Emotionally, I still struggled with the conditioning that told me I was betraying God and disappointing the people I loved most. Therapy helped me understand that these feelings were natural responses to spiritual abuse and that healing would be a gradual process. 3 years after my departure, I received an unexpected phone call. It was my father. His voice was hesitant, almost fragile, as he told me that he had been thinking about our conversations before I left. He said that while he still believed in the organization, he was beginning to have questions of his own. He didn't want to leave his faith, but he wanted to understand mine. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just to talk, not as father and disfellowship son, but as two people trying to understand each other. That conversation was one of the most meaningful of my life. For the first time, my father listened to my story without trying to correct or convert me. He asked genuine questions about my experiences, my beliefs, and my happiness. In return, I listened to his fears, his doubts, and his struggle to reconcile his love for his children with his commitment to his faith. We didn't reach any grand resolution, but we reached something equally valuable: understanding and mutual respect. This breakthrough with my father didn't immediately restore our full relationship or bring my mother around to accepting my choice, but it marked the beginning of a new kind of connection, one where we could love each other despite our fundamental disagreements about spiritual truth. It taught me that healing was possible, even when complete reconciliation seemed impossible. As I reflect on my journey now, I'm amazed by how much my life has changed and how much I've grown as a person. The young man who sat in that kingdom hall, afraid to question anything he'd been taught, feels like a stranger to me now. I've learned to think critically, to embrace uncertainty, to form my own values based on evidence and experience rather than authority and tradition. I've also learned that leaving a high-control group isn't just about escaping false teachings. It's about reclaiming your fundamental humanity. It's about recognizing that you have the right to think your own thoughts, to feel your own feelings, to make your own choices, and to live according to your own conscience. These might seem like basic human rights, but for those of us who grew up in controlling environments, they can feel revolutionary. My relationship with spirituality has evolved as well. I no longer need an organization to tell me how to connect with the divine or what that connection should look like. I find God, or whatever name you want to give the mysterious force that seems to guide and sustain life. In moments of beauty, in acts of kindness, in the bonds of genuine love, and in the quiet voice of conscience that led me away from conformity and toward authenticity. I've also discovered that leaving organized religion doesn't mean abandoning all spiritual principles or moral guidelines. If anything, I've become more committed to values like honesty, compassion, justice, and personal growth. The difference is that these values now come from my own convictions rather than from external commands. They feel more genuine, more personally meaningful, and more sustainable than the rule-based morality I once followed. One of the most surprising aspects of my journey has been discovering how common my experience actually is. Thousands of people leave high-control religious groups every year, and millions more struggle with doubts and questions while remaining within these organizations. Meeting others who had walked similar paths helped me realize that my story, while personally unique, was part of a larger human pattern of growth, questioning, and spiritual evolution. I've also learned that healing from spiritual abuse is an ongoing process rather than a one-time event. There are still moments when I feel uncertain about my choices, when I miss the security of having all my decisions made for me, or when I grieve the relationships that were lost when I chose authenticity over conformity. But these moments are becoming less frequent and less intense as I continue to build a life that reflects my true values and desires. Looking toward the future, I'm filled with a sense of possibility that I never experienced as a witness. I don't know exactly what my life will look like in 5 or 10 years. And for the first time, that uncertainty feels exciting rather than terrifying. I'm free to pursue education, career opportunities, relationships, and experiences that align with my interests and values rather than organizational expectations. I'm also committed to using my experience to help others who are questioning their own faith situations or struggling to leave controlling environments. Through my work as a counselor and through informal connections with online communities, I've been able to support dozens of people through their own journeys of awakening and departure. Being able to turn my pain into purpose has been incredibly healing and has given my struggle meaning beyond my personal growth to anyone who might be listening to this and recognizing elements of their own story. I want you to know that you're not alone. The doubts you're experiencing, the questions you're afraid to ask, the longing for something more authentic than what you've been told to accept. These are all signs of your inner wisdom trying to guide you toward truth and freedom. Leaving everything you've ever known is terrifying, and I won't pretend it's easy. You may lose relationships, security, and community. You may face periods of loneliness, uncertainty, and grief. But you may also discover parts of yourself you never knew existed. You may find genuine love and friendship that doesn't require you to pretend to be someone you're not. You may experience the incredible joy of living according to your own conscience rather than someone else's rules. The path forward isn't the same for everyone. Some people find healing within reformed versions of their original faith. Others embrace different spiritual traditions. Still others, like myself, create their own unique spiritual path. What matters isn't the specific choices you make, but that they're truly your choices made from a place of honesty, reflection, and personal conviction. If you're someone who has never experienced life in a high-control group, I hope my story helps you understand the complexity of these situations and the courage it takes for people to leave everything they've known in pursuit of truth. Please be patient with those of us who are learning to think and choose for ourselves. We may seem naive about things that seem obvious to you, but we're doing our best to catch up on a lifetime of missed experiences and suppressed thoughts. As I finish sharing my story, I'm sitting in the same room where I began, but I'm not the same person who started speaking. Telling this story has reminded me of how far I've traveled, how much I've learned, and how grateful I am for the difficult journey that brought me to where I am today. The young Jehovah's Witness who was afraid to question anything has become a man who isn't afraid to question everything. My life now is not perfect, but it's authentic. My relationships are not numerous, but they're genuine. My beliefs are not certain, but they're honest. My future is not guaranteed, but it's my own. And for the first time in my life, that feels like enough. In fact, it feels like everything. The discovery that changed my life wasn't finding new answers to old questions. It was learning that I had the right to ask the questions in the first place. It was realizing that truth isn't something that's handed down from authority figures, but something that emerges from honest inquiry, careful consideration, and the courage to follow your conscience even when it leads you away from everything familiar and safe. That realization has made all the difference, and it continues to guide me as I move forward into whatever comes next. The fear is still there sometimes, but so is the excitement. The grief over what I've lost remains, but so does the gratitude for what I've found. And the questions that started this whole journey continue to lead me toward new discoveries, new growth, and new possibilities for what it means to be authentically human in this complex and beautiful world. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for taking this journey with me. And if any part of what I've shared resonates with your own experience or your own questions, thank you for having the courage to listen, not just to my voice, but to the voice of your own authentic self that's been waiting patiently for you to pay attention to what it's been trying to tell you all along.